I'm invisible. You can't see me.
I can't see you.
Welcome back to the Fremont Podcast.
I don't know if it's cloudy or bright.
All right, everybody. Well, got an episode today. We got to cover a lot of ground, so we're just going to jump right in. But we're going to be talking about DEI. Good idea, bad idea. Recently, you might have seen the Chick-Fil-A stuff where they, implemented this program, or I don't know if it was an old program they rebooted and just rebranded or whatever. But we're going to talk about that today and why it's ultimately not a good idea. But I want to start back in the Diz-A, we did an interview with Monique from Center for Biblical Unity, and I actually asked her about this topic, but I put it on the Patreon only episode, like little episode thing. So I wanted to bring that out and let you guys kind of check out what she said back then, because I think it's a good start to this conversation. Let me pull it up right here. All right, and I'm gonna play this. So y'all take a listen to this real quick. This is our original question to her. Here we go. Let me watch. Ask you one about diversity, equity, inclusion departments at Christian organizations. Thoughts?
No. Just
why
no.
not?
No, because diversity, equity, and inclusion automatically come with a certain set of principles, precepts, tenets. And so if you want to have an office of unity, I could be cool with that. Like I could get on board with how do we do unity within our institution. But the idea that we are looking specifically for diversity, specifically for equity, and specifically for inclusion. These are three words that have a ton of meaning to them and cultural, not just baggage, but cultural tenets. And so if I am looking, let's say at my Christian university for a diversity, equity, and inclusion officer, and I am not aware that inclusion also is deeply rooted in LGBTQ plus theory. Well, when the person who identifies as Two-Spirit decides they want to come along and apply for a position, well, how do I say no?
Wow.
You know, we have to understand what these words actually mean and that they have a lot of meaning embedded in them. And we don't have to use or adopt the cultural narrative. If we are going to be the set apart ones, we can truly be the set apart ones and impact culture as being someone who is set apart. And I'm not saying you have to be so set apart that, you don't believe that the sky is blue or, that the earth is round. But we do want to make sure that as we participate with each other and with culture, that we are using biblical terms. Unity is a biblical term.
Love her.
Yeah, man, that was great. And Nerva was identifying as Two-Spirit last week, but I got it back on One Spirit, y'all.
I'm back in line.
You back in line. So that was a great little succinct, capturing of DEI. Just it comes with presuppositions. It comes out of a framework. It wasn't like these terms that people were vying over. It was actually birthed in the framework of critical theory. And has all those things built into the very essence of it. And it's not, so ultimately I'm going to argue, because actually Neil Shenvey, good friend of the podcast, and we have learned, a ton from him over the years on this topic. And got nothing but mad love and respect for Neil. But he wrote an article, and it came out right around the same time as the Chick-fil-A stuff was dropping, and he was saying this, there's a way to do DEI rightly. It was a talk he actually gave at a Christian university. I'm ultimately gonna break that down and analyze that in this conversation and come out actually probably disagreeing with Neil, like on the whole with his approach on it, but also recognizing like he does bring up some good points that are worth thinking through. And I know Monique and Krista are good friends with Neil too. So I don't know if Monique would still hold to that with Neil, but I'm not sure where she would say on that. But I think this is a good starting place to think through DEI. Any thoughts so far, babe, before I jump to the next
I'm curious to know Neil's position. Like how can you do it biblically with those same presuppositions. So
Right.
It'd be interesting to hear what he has
Yeah,
to say.
yeah, it is interesting. And what I like about Neil is like even when you disagree with him, he always lays things out clearly. He's a good thinker, clear thinker, very analytical. So it's easy to follow his train
Okay.
of thought and find out where, from my perspective, like he missed the sum here.
Okay.
But in his overall calculus problem, like the whole in general, it's not bad. It's just a couple key points where I think it just goes the wrong direction. So ultimately undermines the attempt to rescue DEI
Okay.
as a legitimate enterprise for a Christian institution. But what I want to start with, the reason I even brought this topic up, because we got an email from a listener who is an owner and operator of a Chick-Fil-A store. And I won't say where, I would keep them anonymous. I did ask their permission to talk about this, and they did grant that. But I told them I'd rather, keep it anonymous for their sakes. But anyways, they're an owner operator, Chick-fil-A, been with the company, I think 10 years or more. And they saw this DEI thing. They got an internal message. I don't know if it was, I can't remember how recent it was. Mm-hmm. It was the past couple years or whatever. But they got a message about this, and so they raised some questions and started like kind of reaching out to some of the higher ups that they had a relationship with in the company, and were dismissed, kind of like this and that. Like the people weren't taking their objections to this DEI program very seriously. And so at this point, this person decided to write a letter, like an open letter to the executive committee at Chick-fil-A. And I want to read, I don't know if I'll read the whole thing here. I got a lot of material to cover, but I'll try to read it quickly too. So if it's too fast, you can slow it down, but I think it'll be all right. So I love this brand. This is what they write. I love this brand. I love the principles that Truett firmly held as he built this brand. I joyfully signed up to carry his name and in turn the Cathy family name, as I now do my best to faithfully steward the opportunity of being an owner-operator. The values on which Chick-fil-A were built were not just something I found nice, but the core motivating factor for me wanting to commit my entire career with Chick-fil-A. I didn't necessarily have a passion for the food industry. I had a passion for aligning my life and living out my guiding values. I evaluated my many vocational options and filtered them based on which I felt would allow me to live out my faith. Chick-fil-A was the perfect fit. We are not a church, but we are unapologetic about biblical principles dictating the direction we wanted to go. Now I'm gonna pause there. I think that is true of Chick-fil-A. And that's the part that like people are like, man, we want you guys to hold on to that. Okay. Continuing on here. I forsook more money and different career opportunities to be a part of what I felt was alignment to a higher vision, to the corporate purpose Truett, Dan, Bubba, and the rest of the team put together in the 80s. I greatly fear we are turning from that purpose and in turn leaving our most loyal operators and most loyal guests behind. I have asked our executive team at our planning meetings each of the past 2 years to help me understand the value add of DEI department. It's not even just a department, but labeled a strategic bet, quote unquote, as if our future growth was dependent on it. Specifically, I asked the following. Now, before I go on, I guess in these internal communications, they labeled doing this program a strategic bet on behalf of the company. I guess I'm not sure the full, and he's even asking that, like, I think they're trying to place like what's going to best serve the growth of the company.
Gotcha.
So we're betting on doing this DEI thing is actually going to help us more than it hurts us.
Gotcha. Okay. They must.
So
some people are slower learners. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, man. So how does this large investment make us grow, make us as an organization better? What metrics are you using to evaluate if this department is successful? What is wrong with simply living out honor, dignity, and respect? Are you implying that owner-operators are racist and need these tools? The response across the board has been the same, as if with no conviction behind it. Quote, we are living out our corporate purpose. We aren't doing anything different than we always have been, unquote. The lack of clarity and seeming dismissal when asking these questions in person has led me to pen this letter. At best, your response is dangerously ignorant. At worst, you are hiding behind vague responses because your team knows the malicious intent of DEI, and you don't want to speak openly to operators about the truth on why we have this department. I think that was a great sentence there. I genuinely trust Andrew and the Kathy family's heart. Now, pause for a second. I think Andrew, if I'm not mistaken, is the current CEO of Chick-Fil-A. I think he's Dan's son, and maybe 43 years of age. Pretty sure, but so going back to here, let's see. I genuinely trust Andrew and the Kathy's family heart, so I'm going to assume you are not fully aware of the dangers. I pray you receive this as a loving rebuke from a friend and not a hostile attack from an enemy.
That's good. I like that.
I fear a department devoted to DEI opens the door to very unbiblical ideas of thinkers like Ibram X. Kendi. These ideas have become authoritative in the DEI push over the past few years and view success only as culture change. That's important because that is definitely the case. It is definitely influenced by Ibram X. Kendi, and the only progress that's measured is change in statistical outcomes for groups that are on the oppressed side of the binary. So it's a power shift, that kind of thing. So continuing on. Inherently, Chick-fil-A cannot say our DEI department is doing what we have always been doing because definitionally that isn't DEI's aim as stated by those who defined DEI long before Chick-fil-A started. Our corporate purpose starts with, quote, to glorify God by ... unquote. This is where I and many others have the biggest issue. If we are going to claim that, we must back that up. If we are going to claim that, we must back that up. Instituting a DEI policy is inherently committing the sin of partiality. Now, he's exactly right about that. The tenets of DEI would have you judge people on their external attributes as opposed to merit. DEI requires discrimination. It is just a form of discrimination which our woke culture approves. This framework is fundamentally different than treating all with honor, dignity, and respect, which is in quotes. That's a Chick-fil-A, quote from their organization, which Chick-fil-A has always strived to do. Better at together, that's in quotes, is a phrase of 3 words strung together that don't mean anything. Please stop hiding behind fluffy language and instead be forthright. Please define what success is for this eerily timed new department. DEI does not mean what most may assume it means. Our current culture engages in what I call linguistic theft. Words are often redefined. If you are not staying alert, as 1 Peter 5:8-9 says, we will be devoured. The words composing DEI hold vastly different meanings in our culture, regardless of how we think we define DEI at Chick-fil-A. So he's going to give, break down each of these words as they're defined by the people that crafted this doctrine. So diversity now means more than just having a variety of viewpoints represented, which Chick-fil-A was already doing. Diversity in current practice focuses almost solely on physical and cultural differences, and thus has to inherently believe in the concepts of privilege and structural marginalization to be achieved. Ironically, diversity now tends to mean uniformity of viewpoint because there isn't a place for us operators who thoughtfully have come to the conclusion that we don't need a DEI department. In other words, there's no place for that viewpoint to be included, right? And that's in essence of when you throw these terms around, like they don't really mean what you think they mean. The D in DEI, continuing on, aims to privilege the marginalized and marginalize the privileged. E, equity, is not equality. Equality is treating everyone equally, which is not just a good idea, but a biblical command. Equity is a redistribution of social and potentially economic capital across the intersectional hierarchy. It is a focus on outcome versus opportunity. What outcomes within Chick-fil-A were so bad that we need to arbitrarily cede authority to Kimberly Crenshaw's ideas of intersectionality? The truth is, all people are made in the image of God, but not all ideas and not all actions are. Outcomes have no guarantee of being equal in any area of life. This isn't a value statement, but rather a natural law. So how can we assess when we at Chick-fil-A are finally an equitable company, right?
Right. How?
You can only do it by looking at these stats and saying, oh man, we've equaled the outcomes, and that requires partiality on the input side. And that's what, Thomas Sowell has done vast empirical studies on, is noting like when you don't load the dice on the front end, or you don't, stack the deck, then almost inevitably inequity results. Like disparities is part of the natural law. Like that's part of how things are. Some people are more talented. Some people have better starting positions economically or with a family. Like there's all kinds of
Different
things,
gifts.
cultural practices, all those things
Strengths and weaknesses.
inevitably lead when you kind of take your hands off from the top down to disparities in the outcomes. So you have to intentionally change that and shift it on the front end to get which is partiality from a biblical perspective. So you can't commit to equity is defined by the DEI programs without running against biblical justice, is what he's saying in essence. So inclusion is the antithesis to meritocracy. Inclusion now says not that we are kind to all, but that everyone's feelings are equally as valid, and thus requiring accommodation at all costs.
Except for his.
Right. Exactly. And that, he pointed out that earlier, right? It is the embodiment of an idea called standpoint epistemology, which in layman's terms boils down to my truth and your truth, not the truth. Worse yet, in order to be properly inclusive, an organization must exclude certain ideas, certain practices, or even certain words. It is due to inclusion that some companies now cannot say ladies and gentlemen. I think Disney stopped doing that.
Oh my gosh.
Moving on from an indisputable truth that humans can embody two genders. What happens when someone in our organization doesn't feel included by the phrase glorify God because they worship something else? It's one thing to not force anyone's particular religion on another. It's entirely different to change our culture because some people feel a specific way about our purpose. Nothing in these new definitions is glorifying God. By simply having this department, we are ceding truth to those who don't care about biblical principles, especially as we choose to continually double down on it. It is fundamentally not caring when we as individuals don't push others to truth. If we actually want to be the most caring company in the world, quote unquote, like you claim we do, then running from the truth will never get us there. We are enslaving ourselves to the pressure of the highly volatile culture surrounding us. Last little bit here. I'm asking you to stop our DEI program now. Take the painful hit of the protests that will follow and actually glorify God. The longer this continues, the harder it will be to correct course, and faithful owner-operators will be left behind, grossly impacting the culture and direction of this company for future generations. I desire better for us. This isn't trivial. Like an invasive vine choking out a long-standing, thriving plant, by its nature, the demands of DEI will continue to increase. That's exactly right. Last sentence or two here. I ask that you show our business partners and our guests that you will not become leaders and we will not become an organization that will bow to the fickle idols of culture. And even if this means slowing short-term business growth, because if we trade truth for lies, on what foundation will we be standing when the stronger storms hit?
If you want to grow in your confidence in knowing what you believe and why you believe it, if you want to ground your faith in biblical Christianity and step into who God has called you to be, I want to tell you about a great program put on by Impact 360, and it's called Propel. Propel is a one-week transformational leadership and discipleship experience where high school students gather together to be grounded in a biblical worldview as they learn how to follow Jesus, have a godly influence, learn how to disciple their peers, and boldly live out their faith in their daily lives. So they're having 2 sessions this summer. The first one is June 19th through the 25th, and the second one is June 26th through July 2nd. These programs fill up really quickly, and I promise you will not be disappointed. So we'll put the link below if you're interested in looking into it, and we'll see you this summer. It was well written.
Yeah, very well written.
It's awesome.
I think he hit on like major themes there in a clear way.
Ooh, it's Chick-Fil-A was there's some other organizations still standing, but Chick-Fil-A was the fast food
right
icon of just the Christian way.
Yep.
It's such a beautiful culture. I repent of my ways, but I don't have hope. I'm sorry. It's like This is just a sign that
Yeah.
this ideology is spreading everywhere, to
man.
everyone's doorstep, to every single organization that exists. And so it can feel like a blow when you see an organization such as Chick-Fil-A bow
Yes.
and take their stand.
Yeah, man. Yeah, and this
to this. It's
this
hard.
relates back to when we addressed, we could see this sort
I saw,
trajectory if you go back to, I can't remember if it was season 1 or 2.
Right.
But when they first stopped funding FCA and Salvation Army and the reason given for it and all that kind of stuff, that was the initial bow. And this is how this happens. Like, this is why we said back then, you cannot give the woke ideology an inch. It's not something. It's like that vine that chokes out.
They won't
like,
compromise.
yeah. They will not relent.
It's their way or the highway. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're going to take you, like, they'll take you the full route. They're not going to take you toward their city or toward their destination and drop you off along the way and let you stay there. No, they're like, once you get in this car, it's locked from the inside, and you're going the whole distance. And it gets harder and harder actually to get out. I share your
Sorry, I repented
pessimism.
my ways.
But I do think, what I even responded to this listener on the second email, I was like, I think it's worth fighting for still. I think there's enough good people there. There's enough of a foundation that if you get enough people behind something like this to get them to really look at it, I'm still holding out hope that maybe they don't know what they're getting into here. It might be a fool's hope. But if you get enough strength, maybe it's not too late to turn this thing around and make a shift, or maybe another company can learn from this. Who knows? But we either way, we watched Endgame last night, and so sometimes you got to go out there and face Thanos, and in this case, it's the ideology
in the face of it.
In the face of it all.
Okay.
So I think that when I was thinking about this, I think Monique is exactly right. I think this listener is exactly right. But I can hear like one potential response would be like, well, what about what Neil is saying with this DEI? Can it be done rightly? Maybe Chick-fil-A, maybe it can be in line with their values if they make some adjustments. So we've had that conversation with Christian nationalism, right? Is there a way to biblically define it and implement it? That takes out some of the more, I guess, unsavory elements. Now there is a difference between those two that I'll actually get into, and I hope we have time to really go through this. We may have to split this up into two parts if not, but because I think it's worth really digging in on this article and going through this. So if you're following along, if you're watching, I'm gonna pull it up here so you can actually follow along with us. So this is a talk Neil recently did at Life Pacific University. So it reads more like a talk than a book, but I think you'll still get the idea of what he's saying here. It's called DEI Done Right, Disentangling Christian Community from Critical Theory.
Okay.
So he says, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to try to highlight the important parts here. The phrase diversity, equity, inclusion elicits vastly different responses from different people. Liberals tend to view DEI as a crucial component of any institution truly committed to social justice. There's another buzzword. Conservatives tend to view DEI as empty virtue signaling at best and wholly corrupted enterprise at worst. So which is it? Now, I think Neil would say this too, he's setting it up for his talk, but actually those aren't in opposition. So it's not which is it, one of those two, that both of those are true. Like the liberals are right about that. The DEI is a crucial component to any institution committed to social justice, because that social justice is critical theory.
Okay.
So it's not like once you understand social justice as biblical injustice, you would say, yeah, they're right. Like DEI is committed to that. It's committed to the woke ideology. So that's right. And the conservatives are right that it's a wholly corrupted enterprise. So I would say not either or. So he goes on, he says, well, here's the bad news. I'm going to argue that most DEI programs are rooted in contemporary critical theory, a deeply unbiblical ideology that Christians must reject. Now, what do you see in that sentence? Sorry, I'm testing you here. I know it's early in the morning too. But if the word here that's important that I think that he's sort of like, that's going to help him soften the blow of DEI, one word is most. You see that? So he says, I'm going to argue that most DEI programs are rooted in contemporary critical theory. Now, I think that is just false.
How so?
I think all.
Oh, okay.
So you see how you can soften it there with most. And now, all is a harder claim, but I think he's using most on purpose to say, because if you say most, then there are already some at least that aren't committed to critical theory.
Okay.
But I'm just going to let you know, like, I've seen probably, I don't know, close to 100 of these DEI programs, and I haven't seen one that's not committed to critical theory.
Okay.
And so, and that's not an accident. That's because the program is based on that.
Yeah, it's based on that.
So I think there's already kind of like a tricky softening here. Not a tricky, because I don't want to say he's doing it in a tricky manner, but I think that sets you up to not see that empirically. Like, I'm open. Like, if anybody's listening here, and you can find a DEI program that's not what is his word here? That's not rooted in contemporary critical theory, send it to me. I haven't seen one yet, and I've seen a ton of them. That's all I'm saying. So I would say, instead of most, I would say I'm going to argue that while every DEI program that I'm aware of is rooted in critical theory, it doesn't theoretically have to be. I think that would be a better argument. Okay. Theoretically, I just haven't seen it. Maybe he has, and I know he does a lot in this, so I'll give him, the benefit of the doubt there. So let's see. This fundamentally unbiblical and understanding of diversity, equity, inclusion is so ubiquitous that I'm not very comfortable with Christians even using the phrase diversity, equity, inclusion. So I think that is good. Like, I think he's not comfortable with that. But I will say this, I think he is more comfortable with that than he is with Christian nationalism. Okay. And I think it should be reversed, because Christian nationalism doesn't necessarily come out of a framework that is inherently anti-biblical. It's still up for grabs definitionally. Okay. And you have some people that are under that umbrella that are unsavory, but the definitions to me aren't nearly as problematic as DEI. And I just think it lets you kind of know, like, this is more the perspective Neil comes from, and I understand, like, he will say explicitly, like, his main aim is not political. He's not really, his ministry purpose is not really to get into those issues. He's trying to keep the church pure with not falling into woke ideology or into like some kind of racist thing.
Interesting. Okay.
So for him, I think he leans more toward being a little more comfortable with DEI than he is with Christian nationalism. I think it should be the opposite way, but that's just a minor point. So let's see. So he says, now since Marcus invited me, and since he's the director of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Life Pacific University, I have about 10 seconds to turn this talk around before he shuts off my mic and cuts the video, right? Yeah, maybe, but hear me out. My claim is that while most DEI programs are rooted in critical theory, we can think about these concepts in ways that are compatible with Christianity. And again, that most word, I think, softens it. I would say that everyone I'm aware of is rooted in critical theory, but maybe we can, concoct our own version. In other words, he says, we can see our churches, this is important, churches, universities, and institutions as places where diversity, equity, and inclusion can be fostered, provided that we define these terms in a biblical way and explicitly reject definitions rooted in critical theory. My aim here today is to show you how to do that. Okay. Now,
interesting.
In theory,
yeah,
I think it's possible to define anything any way you want. Like, when you look at philosophy books or theology books, a lot of times, especially scholarly ones, they'll spend like the first 5 chapters saying what they mean by certain words. And sometimes they're given idiosyncratic or unique definitions to their own terms. And that's a practice that you can do. I don't think it's a good idea, though, to do that with things that are used like this, like in the real world, because it almost never happens rightly like that. It wouldn't be a good idea for me to redefine white supremacy, for instance, as just a love for Christianity. Right? Or fascism, like I'm gonna redefine fascism as just a proper love for one's nation.
Yeah, and it's like if you're redefining something, unless you're the architects of the ideology, does it spread and push the same? And it's like,
does it carry water because you're going under the same heading?
Right, and might be adding to,
right,
but not necessarily restructuring.
Yes.
So, but I'm still.
But so I want to clarify what I'm doing here, what I'm going to do, because I want to just make this super clear.
Okay.
It doesn't work, practically speaking, to do DEI from a Christian perspective. As far as I can tell, I haven't seen it done yet. And I've seen it tried in Christian institutions that are otherwise very faithful and aware of these issues. So I haven't seen it done practically. The very best case scenario I could ever imagine would be somebody like Neil crafting it for me. Like if I had an institution, I was like, I'm going to try DEI and I want to do it Christianly, I would hire Neil to craft that. Like he's got the intelligence, he understands the woke ideology, and he tries to be biblically faithful. And what I want to say is even this version that Neil tries to craft is problematic.
Okay.
So if even he can't do it at a theoretical level, I would say don't try it in a million years. Just hold on to that idea. If even our brother Neil, who's amazing at this stuff, falls into problems with his theoretical DEI with no social pressure even put on him. Like this isn't some kind of scenario where people are fighting at some school about CRT. Yeah, this is just a theoretical exercise. Even in his theoretical exercise, it falls prey to unbiblical ideas in my perspective that I'm going to try to show.
Okay.
Hold that thought, okay?
You got it.
So let's see. Here's the outline. What's going on with culture? I'm going to skip through this. He talks about the background, like how much the Great Awakening. Well, there is some good stuff worth mentioning here real quick. I've showed this before, but the Smithsonian Institute published an infogram on the aspects and assumptions of whiteness and white culture. This is the Smithsonian. It listed things like objective, rational, linear thinking, cause and effect relationships, ideas like hard work is the key to success as elements of quote unquote whiteness. Okay? Now, Neil says we might expect to see statements like that on a neo-Nazi manifesto, but on an infographic published by the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. What in the world is going on? Fast forward here, here's a few quotes, statements of beliefs from the official Black Lives Matter website. They say they want to, quote, do the work required to dismantle cisgender privilege and uplift black what folk? Trans folk, unquote. And they, quote, foster a queer affirming network and want to free themselves from the tight grip of heteronormative thinking. And they sell T-shirts that say, quote, black future is queer, unquote. A 2021 CNN news article states, it's not possible to know a person's gender identity at birth. And there is no consensus criteria for assigning sex at birth. There's the news for you, folks. And this was not an opinion piece. This is supposedly news, he says. Let's go on here. Finally, the television show Blue's Clues, which is targeted at preschoolers, released a Pride Month sing-along video last year set to the tune of The Ants Go Marching.
Wow.
The lyrics included these stanzas. The babas are non-binary. They love each other so proudly. Ace, Bi, and Pan, grown-ups, you see, can love each other so proudly. On and on, that kind of stuff. We can see that these same ideas in dozens of books by scholars Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X. Kendi. That's who the guy, the operator, Chick-Fil-A operator mentioned. We can also see these ideas in DEI training programs all over the country. Conservative activist Chris Rufo has provided hundreds of pages of primary source documents from DEI trainings at major corporations and schools, all linked with these ideas. For example, at a Walmart training program, employees were told that racism is a, quote, system of racial advantage that benefits white people. unquote. The POC, people of color, can suffer from, quote, internalized racial oppression, unquote, and that, quote, white supremacy culture includes things like worship of the written word, individualism, and objectivity. Walmart. AT&T recommends books like D'Angelo's White Fragility and Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning. A middle school teacher's training program in Missouri asks attendees to locate themselves on the oppression matrix, listing racism, sexism, classism, forms of oppression, all that. These artifacts are just the tip of the iceberg. So what is the iceberg? This is the tip. And he's right. DEI is the tip of the iceberg. It's like to separate that off from that iceberg, I always say is a fool's errand. But what is the iceberg? It's critical theory. Now, if you're unfamiliar, go back and actually you can listen to our episode with Neil where he explains critical theory in depth. Very quickly, 4 elements of contemporary critical theory. You got this system binary, right? Everything's split into the oppressor-oppressed matrix along the lines of race, gender, class, religion, that kind of deal. All right. Then second element is oppression through hegemony. So cultural norms imposed on people by the dominant culture are inherently oppressive. They're defined as oppressive. Lived experience is the third element. That's the standpoint epistemology that the operator mentioned. That's what, shut up, white folks, listen to black voices. But what about, Carol Swain's voice? She's a white voice and a black face, Larry Elder, the black face of white supremacy. So, it's not that's how they utilize to get rid of any objective claims of objectivity to push back on the narrative. They said, no, you got to refer to lived experience. In this case, it's the lived experience that fits the narrative we want to propose. So last one is social justice. And so social justice is defined as basically equalizing the outcomes. So you're involved in political and policy stuff at institutions to try to make that happen. So that's the iceberg that's below DEI. Neil goes on here. He says positive goals of DEI. He says that some kinds of institutional diversity are good and should be encouraged. Formal equality does not guarantee equality of opportunity. Unequal treatment is sometimes fair. He talks about wheelchair ramps, stuff like that. Institutional culture can sometimes unfairly, unintentionally exclude or marginalize. I'll leave it to you guys to read all that. Some of that raises some decent points that you have to wrestle through. I don't think it ultimately props up, though, the idea that you should engage in the kind of DEI that he's going to recommend. So even if you accept his caveats here of the positive goals, it's not positive enough to argue for implementing these things because of the negatives involved. And so here's DEI gone wrong, redefining oppression. So he says, first, DEI programs rooted in critical theory redefine oppression, which leads to a false view of inclusion. In an earlier slide, I showed an oppression matrix used at a teacher training session in Missouri. Why? Because critical theorists have redefined the word oppression. Here are some quotes from his book. I'm not going to go through all those quotes, but basically they've, what he called whiteness, all that can fall under oppression. Any cultural norms that are characteristic or subscribed to by the dominant culture can fall in that. Ibram X. Kendi says the same thing in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. For example, he writes, we cannot be anti-racist. This is an important one. We cannot be anti-racist if we are homophobic or transphobic.
That's a statement to
right?
really process
right.
and to really hear. Those are two separate things, but they're making them one.
Yes.
You're not anti-racist unless, you cannot be anti-racist if. So they've lumped it all together.
And what does he mean by homophobic? He doesn't mean, oh man, I'm scared.
No, he means affirm.
Yeah.
If you don't affirm that there's systematic racism, you're not affirming the other.
If you're not doing it with, cisgender versus transgender, all these things. If you're not working, in his view, it's a package deal. So to be queer anti-racist, Kendi says, is to understand the privileges of my cisgender, of my masculinity, of my heterosexuality, of their intersections.
And see, that's where Black Lives Matter has really pushed that they came,
Right.
they blindsided us with that.
Yeah, so
movement.
it's a package deal
Queers
for all
that
these
look
guys,
yeah.
like Robin DiAngelo, all these guys that are being
Ooh.
hired by these companies to come in and teach DEI, all have this
And
critical
that's
theory.
that's what should be alarming to Christian organizations, because yes, we love all people, but we don't affirm these lifestyles
Right,
because it's unbiblical.
right.
And
So that should alert you to check again.
Jeez.
Check into
Chick-fil-A.
the racist element. Even when they're talking about that, they're off base.
Okay.
And again, Kendi's anti-racism, remember, is not, are there policies that are unjust? It's, are there unequal outcomes among races? If there are, we have to
That's
fix that.
directly
We have to
tied to
discriminate with our
racism.
policies. So you can, the transphobic, yeah, what you got?
He said the only way to fight this is to fight racism is to fight it with racism.
Yes. And he's totally fine with that
He's good with that.
and recommending that. So
Not transformation of the hearts, but just hitting it with
or not even
racism.
transformation of processes that are unjust.
True.
It doesn't even matter. Like
Yeah.
you can shift the process to get the outcome you want. That's partiality,
Yeah.
according to the Bible. That's
Okay.
untenable. So, redefining oppression. Basically, in this chart here, you'll see that according to the Bible, oppression is unjust, tyrannical treatment. But according to critical theory, that is funding DEI thought, oppression is hegemonic norms. Oppression is whiteness. Oppression is gender roles, heterosexism, cisgenderism, adultism. Those things are all under the rubric of what they call oppression. So I'm going to skip down here. Equalizing outcomes. Second, critical theorists adopt the word equity rather than equality, as our writer of the article pointed out. Even though the two are synonyms in most dictionaries, but they're defining them very specifically and very distinctly. There's a picture that Neil puts here that's a popular picture that was going around, and they're talking about equity here. And there's an equal box behind a fence. They're trying to watch the baseball game. You got a tall, the dad, maybe a young son, and then a toddler. They can't see, the toddler can't see, the young son can barely see. So you have to take the dad's box away because he doesn't need it. Put it that to give the extra box to the little toddler so that they can all see above the fence. That's the equity.
There's so much in that picture, though.
So much in that picture.
It's a lot. If you're watching this video, yeah.
So he says, here's a popular cartoon that explains how equity is reconceptualized by critical theory. Equality refers to everyone being treated exactly the same, whereas equity refers to some people being treated differently in order to offset their disadvantages. Now, critical theorists will sometimes insist that equity merely seeks equality of opportunity rather than equality of outcome, as in the case of wheelchair ramps.
But that's not what his book says.
Right.
Equity. And so in that picture, I don't know if you guys see, but
Yeah, what do you see that's
I'm
wrong
seeing,
with that?
the parent and the child should be on equal terms based on this equity. It's like certain hegemonies are necessary to make
Yes.
our culture work. Kids are not on the same level as parents, but they're trying to make it so that kids can make major decisions on their lives and exclude the parents' input, So that's the outworkings of this worldview. It's like very interesting. And I get it. The child can't see. She wants to see the game. Raise them up to the level of the parents. There's a lot in that picture. Go ahead.
Yeah, man. No, you're right. One of the other elements when I saw that, and Neil will actually say this too, is that I'm like, well, the people advocating this, do they think of, people on the oppressed side of the matrix as kids? Like it's kind of insulting, what I'm saying, to put someone, if that's the way you're thinking about it, like that shows you the mindset right there. You've already placed them in this binary. And I'll let him speak to that. But he said, however, that's usually misleading. What advocates of equity usually assume is that if there are unequal outcomes, then there must not have been equality of opportunity. So effectively, they are committed to equality of outcome, even wouldn't explicitly say that, even though they wouldn't explicitly say that in some cases. He references an example by Kamala Harris where she put that video out on Twitter a while back She explains that the problem with equality is that not everyone starts at the same place. Consequently, some people need extra help or resources to overcome their initial disadvantages. How can we tell when equity has been achieved? She explains, quote, equitable treatment means all end up at the same place.
And there's a problem there because some people achieve more because they work harder. Some people don't want to be equal to others. They want to just be their best selves. And that is sometimes unequal. You've got one Michael Jordan, you got one Kobe, you know what I mean?
Right.
It's like, but they want them all on the same,
Yep.
Interesting.
No, isn't that interesting? So he said, so be careful here, the bait and switch. On paper, equity might look like it is merely an attempt to achieve equal opportunity. But in practice, it assumes that unequal outcomes are all attributable to lack of equity. Anti-racist activist Ibram Kendi says this extremely clearly in his books. For example, he writes, quote, racial discrimination is the sole cause of racial disparities in this country and in the world at large. You hear that?
Say it one more time, sorry.
Yep. Racial discrimination is the sole cause of racial disparities. I mean, that's such a ridiculous statement. I don't know how this book ever got published. But if you read a little Thomas Sowell, you'll see this is one of the most ridiculous statements I've ever heard. But Neil says, think about that for a second. Do we really think that, say, disparities between North Korea and Sweden, or between Africa and Australia, or between Asian Americans and Native Americans are solely the result of discrimination? Do we really believe that 75% of players in the NBA are black because of racial discrimination against whites?
Good job, Neil.
But this is exactly what Kendi's claims entail. In fact, he says elsewhere, if you think that racial disparities are caused even partially by anything other than discrimination, then you are, in his words, an assimilationist racist.
Racism. Go ahead.
Oh, gosh. Let me go on to here. Second, we need to recognize that good and just systems produce disparities. Take education. One study found that Asian high school students spend about 2 hours per day doing homework compared to around 1 hour per day for whites. Now imagine that you have a perfectly unbiased, fair educational system. Do you really think that whites and Asians will get the same grades on average when one group studies twice as much on average? Of course not. Now, are our systems perfect and just? By no means, but we can't simply assume that disparities are necessarily evidence of injustice. So basically here he's saying an equity-based disparity equals discrimination model is too simplistic, Neil concludes. Now, here's another example of where I think the language that he's using probably softens it a little bit too much. Because not only is it too simplistic, it's patently false. Too simplistic makes you think, well, it's it can be close to the truth, or
True.
It's right in spirit, but it doesn't. It doesn't take into account all the complications.
Sure.
It's not only that it doesn't take into account all the complications.
It's just wrong.
It's objectively and demonstrably false out of the gate. And so I just want to strengthen that point a little bit. Hey, what's going on, fam? Thanks so much for listening to this episode. It did end up going a little longer than we had initially anticipated, so we're going to have to do a part 2. Try to get that out to you in the next day or two here, but I would highly encourage you, if you can, to listen to that part, because I think it's honestly probably the most important part of this discussion is really responding to the idea that can you do DEI from a Christian perspective, and that's what we're going to argue against, at least this very good attempt at trying to theoretically lay out a case where that would work, and I think it ends up failing. And I think it's important to note that even this very good attempt by a great thinker who understands the issues did not land. And so please take the time, if you can, to listen to that next episode, and we will see you next time.